Yeah, yeah. So let's move on to the third reason, which is you don't have a reasonable salary expectation. And this actually cuts both ways. You are either expecting to pay way more than what an employer is prepared to pay you as somebody who's relatively new, or you actually aren't expecting enough, and so employers aren't taking you seriously. And both of these can be a real big problem. And so, how can you get grounded? Well, it's really difficult to get grounded on salary expectations because you're actually at a great disadvantage. Employers have actual data because they do salary surveys and they actually subscribe to services that are actually provided to them that gives them salary survey data for the metropolitan areas that they're hiring in. And so they actually have hard data. What do we have as job seekers? Well, we're out there on Glassdoor or what have you. We're talking to people on Reddit or Facebook or whatever. But the problem is all that information, all that salary information is really suspect. People tend to inflate what they get paid, or they'll tend to deflate pay, if they've got an axe to grind or something like that. So the playing field is not at all even. So Jason, what do you? I know you've talked about how people can deal with this. So please share.
Yeah, so when it comes to salary expectations, as you said, there's really no true source of information where you can find this unless you're looking at certain positions with certain organizations. So I'll give an example. As you know, I come from the DoD and government sector. In the government sector, all of their pay bands are published and they're open source. You can go online right now and say, this is a GS-12 position, what does that make? This is a GS-14 position, what does that make? And so you'll have an idea of what that salary is going to be. Now, there is a location difference depending on if you're working in Washington, D.C. or Jacksonville, Florida, because Washington, D.C., they give a 15% pay bump or something like that for a cost of living. But again, that's all open source. You can find that online. When you're dealing with DoD contractors, when you're dealing with the civilian world, though, it really is anybody's game. They can pay you whatever they want, and Kip and I might both go for the same job and both get hired. And he might be making $50,000 more than me because he's a better negotiator or he had better information, even though we are completely equivalent in terms of certification, degrees, and years of experience. So salary is just this completely negotiable thing. So what do you do to find out what a reasonable salary is? Well, you got to use the best things you have at your disposal, which right now, unfortunately, is things like Reddit, things like Glassdoor. You can go onto Glassdoor and you can look up the company you're looking at. You can also look up similar companies of a similar size and shape based on job position. So if I'm looking for a vulnerability analyst role and I'm looking at a small company of under 50 people, that may pay $80,000 a year per se, if I look on Glassdoor and find that out. That means when I'm going into a company that's the same size and shape, it should be somewhere plus or minus 10% of $80,000, somewhere in that range. And so that's the idea as you start looking at these things. Another thing is make sure you consider location, because location's important too. If I'm getting hired in San Francisco, $100,000 there does not equal $100,000 in Washington, D.C. or $100,000 in Omaha, Nebraska. Those are three different job markets, three different costs of living. And honestly, if I had those three job offers on the table, I would go live in Omaha because Omaha has a much lower cost of living and my $100,000 is going to go much further. If I was living in San Francisco, that $100,000 is equivalent to, maybe $50,000 in Omaha. So you have to keep those things in mind as well, especially now after we're going through this whole pandemic with COVID and people working from home. Salary expectations are getting really, really weird because even if you're going and applying for a company in San Francisco that may have formerly paid $200,000 for that position, they may now only pay you $100,000 because they know you're going to be working from your home in Florida instead. And so these are all things that you have to consider. So the bottom line here is kind of have an idea of what's reasonable and then work towards that reasonable expectation. And sometimes you're just going to be too far off from the company or they're way too low for what you're willing to accept. And that's okay. They're not the right company for you.
Right. Now, the one last tip that I will give you is if you're able to get into, uh, uh, you know, uh, if you're able to get through a series of interviews and you actually get to a point where you can actually start to negotiate, and the employer's actually prompting you, hey, what are your salary expectations? if you're really good at this, and you can get good at this, you may not feel like you're very good at negotiations right now, but you can actually get really good at this, where you can actually get the employer to tell you what their salary range is, even if they didn't publish it in the job description. But one thing I will definitely tell you never to do is never tell the employer what you make now, and never tell them any previous salary you've ever made. That would put you at a great disadvantage.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I'll tell you from a smaller employer side, I'm a small company. We have under 20 people in our company. Right now, I think we have 12 or 13 on staff. And it is really difficult for me when I'm hiring a new position to go, what does this new position make, or what should it make? A good example of this is I hired somebody to help me with all the technical customer support questions. Nobody else in my company had his background or his knowledge, but I needed that more extensive background and knowledge to help with certifications like Security Plus, CYSA Plus, Pen Test Plus, and things like that. And so when I had to look at his salary versus others, I had to figure out what was the right number that would make somebody with that qualifications come work for me and make him so that we can afford him. And so it was really a balancing act. And when I asked him what he wanted to make, he didn't know either, right? So we were both kind of like struggling, going, does this number sound good? How about this number? And we kind of went back and forth because I knew I wanted to hire him and he knew he wanted to work for me, but we both weren't sure exactly what the right number was. With bigger companies, there's a lot more restrictions. They already know what their pay bands are for certain things. But if you're going to be the first or maybe the second or third cybersecurity person at that company, they may not even know what right is for you, because cybersecurity pays differently than IT, than HR, than a secretary, than admin assistant, or any of those other things. So it is a hard thing to do on both sides of the table.